During World War II, the British Empire recruited hundreds of thousands of African soldiers to fight in Africa, Asia and the Middle East. When peace came, the survivors faced discrimination and neglect, many being abandoned to poverty in a shaming act of colonial disregard. Now we've been to investigate the plight of Britain's African veterans, the forgotten heroes of its empire.
Lusaka, Zambia, November 2018, and a royal visit is underway.
Prince Harry arrived last night. He's here today. He'll ask you questions. Do try and reply. So look pleased, look happy. Okay?
My name is Wright Jason Kosa. I'm now 94 years old. I was a soldier of the British Empire. World War II, we suffered a lot.
Justin Koza was one of several 100,000 Africans who fought for the British during World War II, and one of the many who later felt abandoned to a life of poverty and neglect.
Look what is my house, look. This is not good.
Prince Harry has come to Zambia to pay his country's respects to its African veterans. Justin hopes his meeting with the prince will also raise awareness of his plight.
So I can try to report into UK when he come back, so that, Mr. Kosa, this house is not good. British and ourselves, we will suffer together. After when we come back, I will never forget you, and you will never forget me, because we suffered together.
The war in Africa. Here on the Kenya front, many different types of men are defending the British Empire.
During the Second World War, more than 500,000 African troops served with the British Army. Many deployed thousands of miles from home, across the continent, the Middle East and Burma. It was part of the largest single movement of African men overseas since the slave trade. It would expose them to the horrors of battle in the desert and jungle and cost many thousands of lives. During their service, Britain would also subject these men to systematic racism and prejudice, and on their return, they would suffer the indifference of an empire on which the sun was soon to set. Now, with the number of Britain's African veterans dwindling fast, there are calls to fully acknowledge those sacrifices and belatedly make amends for their post-war neglect.
We should be ashamed that veterans who fought for our country are living in that poverty. We have an opportunity in their twilight years to get that right. It's not too late.
Na Japani tunio ya niyo tuegere niyo muno utogeshera na yakuru kidakani leo chera ni yakuru kidakani kolo lisaje kalingerwa gwe no gutokerekera we tonetelo nkole gwetiga.
At a war grave cemetery near Mount Kenya, Eusebio Mbuki and Gershon Fundi have come to pay their respects to their fallen comrades. Both men fought for Britain during World War II, facing death and hardship in battlefields far from home.
Gokira, lilo kona mtu ukinyandi, nonga ukinyandi, elo unoge jaga na ofia, ukegwa ya na kukuduka, lakini uchoka nyuma, we, utechoka nyuma, ukachoka nyuma tuena kwe ngokulaga.
As with many soldiers recruited from Britain's colonies, Eusebio had little idea of what was at stake in this war.
menya tutalwaga tukimenya nimbi twathikulwira riu twalwaga nuntu anibo batutongoretie na twari mene tampo ijiao riu twalwaga tupatwirite dinio tukathi.
I believe for those dead, and I don't know why I'm still alive. For all those years.
When World War II began in 1939, European powers had colonized most of Africa. Britain quickly put its many African colonies on a war footing, much as it had done in World War I some years before. Yet at first, officials were doubtful about the role so-called native African soldiers might play in the conflict. Some were even opposed to giving them arms or mixing them with white soldiers, reflecting the widespread prejudice of the time.
Racism was pervasive in the 1930s and 40s. It was perfectly acceptable to be a racist in polite Western society.
Whom the whites still look upon, in the words of Rudyard Kipling, as the new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
Timothy Parsons is a historian and one of the world's leading authorities on Britain's East African Army. He champions the rights of these colonial-era soldiers and has dedicated his life to chronicling their lost history.
The imperial system was riddled with racism. There were people who were unapologetic racists at all levels of civil society, at all levels of the military institutions.
The whites feel obliged to keep them in political and economic inferiority.
No one volunteers to live under an empire. They're authoritarian states that are almost invariably 100% built by conquest. The subjects of an empire have no rights. Now, the British Empire was arguably the most benign of the world's empires. They justified these conquests on this paternalist, idealistic rhetoric and on the assumption that Africans were at an inferior stage of development and then needed a helping hand.
By 1940, Nazi Germany and its Italian allies were making gains in Europe and North Africa. Isolated, undermanned, and increasingly concerned about the Japanese threat to its Asian dominions, Britain desperately needed more troops. So, despite earlier reservations, it turned to its African colonies, launching an intense recruitment drive.
Mwema bwani 1918 na ngechwa nkeguranira wa mwema na ntadi wuntu gungi.
Many Africans were reluctant to enlist in this white man's war, but Britain had three key tactics to recruit them. The first was presenting army life as economic opportunity. Another was propaganda, which warned that Hitler wanted to seize their land that of course had already been colonized by the British themselves. There was a third means of recruitment: force. Officially, conscription was ruled out and enlistment was supposed to be entirely voluntary. But desperate to raise numbers, colonial officials would often pressure local chiefs and elders to find them men, and turn a blind eye to how they went about it.
The way men were actually recruited was often that the chiefs would press gang men. In some cases, they would press gang men who were out of favor. Men were definitely swept up into the combat units who were absolutely not volunteers.
Grace Mbithe, a widow now living in the highlands near Nairobi, remembers how the chief's men snatched her husband from their village before he was sent off to North Africa.
Utuma mona wa kwatwa andumea nona na we bitha mayu ko ilaingi na netwa iye mona ila twa wiye no kwatiwa ko teta ya we no ndo ndasyo kanu kuga na ke kuye the na the ni mona.
Although one of those who volunteered, Eusebio too faced miserable conditions in the forests and steep river valleys of Burma. Heavy rain, tropical disease, and thick jungle, rations were in short supply.
Tolemwek, uota, uteidio ne tombe skuti tat kapagiti kama kambe skuti weke etea. Na tusukari tuaku kemu koni. Na toje na tu utega didia ke boyoni. Uka didia ne dena. Uka na watu.
In theory, African soldiers in Britain's forces were subject to the same military discipline as all its other troops. However, in reality there were some notable differences. They were barred from becoming commissioned officers and from disciplining lower-ranking white soldiers. More disturbingly, corporal punishment, which the British Army had officially outlawed for decades elsewhere, was still used against its African troops throughout World War II. Beatings were not uncommon.
Koriwa mono. Koriwa kedra mwere neta mitne ne wimba. Ori etwe. Ala? Na koringa ngwa mono na mpe na ambi. Paka wakete kila pura ukwero. Note no na kote adia. Ukade diao. Ane. Mono ne bere twe o na kodokia. Ne aliwe. Na uwe mono. We
are not happy to be in that war. We are treating us as slaves. We are there not because we wanted to be there, but we are forced to go there.
Gershon Fundi was not one of Britain's willing recruits. He was sent to Ethiopia and Somaliland as a signalman, relaying messages between units.
If you run, even you go to home, since you arrest you, then you are going to be brought back. But how can you complain? To whom you are going to complain? To whom? Because you have no power. You won't be able to reach those high-ranking officers. We have no voice. We have no voice at all.
Kainge mono, why Syria na tuado dekia? Okaura. Again, Okawa, Gainante die. Again, Okawa.
But if the harsh discipline and brutal combat were hard to bear, they were compounded by the treatment that soldiers like Eusebio received when victory came. Discrimination would not be limited to the war years. Once a soldier left the army, Britain paid him a lump sum known as a war gratuity. But this payout wasn't only based on the soldier's rank and the length of his service. It also reflected his colonial origins and ethnicity. This document, long hidden in Britain's war archives, shines a light on this racial hierarchy. The government paper reveals that white personnel, even those living in African colonies, could receive 3 times the amount of their black counterparts.
Different levels of compensation meant that the colonial regime placed a different value on African life than it did on European life. European settlers are considered to be more civilized and therefore more deserving of a higher payment.
Britain's state-endorsed colour bar extended to Asian personnel recruited in British East Africa too. These troops received less than their white comrades, but more than African soldiers.
Watekio vampete, unekapeja kumenya, antoba ne batutete tejaidi. Kato palo miage into fulani. Leo gotage ogu. Leo tigani dwetua ogu.
When Japan surrendered in 1945, Britain prioritized demobilizing its white troops, putting black soldiers to the back of the line. Many Africans remained in Asia for 2 years after the war had ended. Although their role in the war was praised by Winston Churchill and others, before long, a cash-strapped Britain was soon quietly downplaying the contribution that African soldiers had made to the Allied victory.
There was explicit propaganda directed at African soldiers trying to remind them that they had only played a small role and that they should not have high expectations.
They gave me nothing. I just went home and that's all.
Even when soldiers came back, their war wasn't over. Many veterans brought the trauma of conflict into the family home.
kukuna ngoja kuna muno piu kwanza utuko tukaleo koma na nikulilika na maondo asuma enda monaku ati kwanza mbuya tiko mete wa ayokela ayekala nde ayuwa ngo eso kunete ukuna na ngo ndoku muno na no yode si omuwa.
Victoria Mutheu is a Kenyan scholar on a mission to preserve this vanishing history. She believes that Africans who fought for Britain should not be forgotten. Her late grandfather served as a World War II medic. His service instilled in her a passion for the era.
My grandfather talked about his wartime experiences when we were young children. We'd learned about World War II in school, yes, but not to the point of being told that Kenyans fought in World War II.
During the war, Britain's propaganda ministry produced a pamphlet about its East African soldiers, which distilled the era's condescending views.
In the first picture, this was a military man from the Zulu kingdom, the raw material. The second picture is talking about a finished product. This is modern warfare. The colonial mindset towards African people was negative. They believed they were lesser. Just by looking at this, they were made to look like simple people. There's racism in it. They were not very valued that highly at the time. If you felt this person wasn't valuable to that extent, then you should not have involved them in your affairs, right? So go do your wars, but don't call other people to help you if you cannot see them for their true worth.
But not everyone has forgotten the wartime heroics of Britain's African veterans. At Lusaka International Airport, a former brigadier of Britain's colonial forces is arriving for a week in Zambia. David Williams is president of the King's African Rifles Association, the regiment for which Eusebio and Gershon once fought. Williams has flown in from England to pay his respects to his African comrades at a memorial event.
My roots in Africa are very deep. I was educated in what was southern Rhodesia. As kids, we used to spend a lot of time in the bush. It was a very good life and much enjoyed it. One's heart remains in Africa firmly.
Williams's destination is Mbala, a small town in the far north of the country. He's travelling with a crew of history buffs and descendants of colonial-era commanders who are stopping off at key points along the way to remember the fallen.
I was commissioned into the 1st Battalion of the King's African Rifles, with lots of time spent in the bush on exercises, getting to know one's men, and obviously forming a good bond. They are very fine soldiers, and they have proven to be so. The African soldier had absolute innate qualities. When he goes into the bush, he is immediately like a hunter. A British soldier, you often find you have to impose a discipline in, whereas an African is very, very well equipped. One looks back with fond memories, and of course, one having established that bond with the African soldiers, one is continued to be keen to fulfill what one regards as a sort of obligation towards them. They fought for the defense of the British Empire and Western values at a time when that was threatened.
On their journey of remembrance, Williams's entourage spend the night at a colonial-era mansion. Some of those present either grew up in a colony or served in Britain's armed forces.
Would someone like to say grace for us, please?
Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful opportunity for all of us.
There's no question, when I was growing up, we were living in a country where there was a measure of racism. I mean, I think on the most positive thing you could say, it was a form of paternalism. One was establishing good principles of rule of law and education, great infrastructures in the country. Those of us who lived in Africa, we were living at the end of an era. This was obviously going to change, overdue for change. We're all members of our association are passionately committed to making sure that we honor the legacy of all African soldiers.
Racism, paternalistic or otherwise, was ingrained in the fabric of the British Empire and its armed forces. But that doesn't negate the fact that many individual British officers felt, and continue to feel, a deep sense of loyalty towards their African comrades. Even in the 1940s, some commanding officers are on record as standing up for African soldiers and demanding they be provided with pensions. To this day, Williams's organisation and the Royal Commonwealth Ex-Services League raise funds for these veterans. By them at least, they are not forgotten.
They were brave and loyal soldiers of Christian, Muslim or no faith who volunteered to serve the British Crown and were in most cases fighting far from home.
Among the VIPs at the event is the former Chief of the UK Armed Forces, General Lord Richards. For him, Britain's mistreatment of African veterans and the poverty they face today is a national disgrace.
We should be ashamed that veterans who fought for our country are living in that poverty. We have an opportunity in their twilight years to get that right. It's not too late. We can still make amends. We're talking about people who fought for us in the most horrendous circumstances. Surely, if Britain and the British people mean anything, it's about generosity of spirit. And I feel our political leadership sometimes doesn't remember that. This is a battle that's not yet won.
The UK's Ministry of Defence did not respond to our repeated requests for comment, yet there are signs that government policy could be changing. In November 2018, as the world prepared to mark the centenary of the end of the Great War, Britain announced a £12 million package to help impoverished veterans and war widows from Commonwealth nations. But senior officials insist that this relatively modest sum is aid, not compensation.
It's not designed to atone. What it is designed to do is provide some very practical support. What my department does, our core mission, is to alleviate extreme poverty. About half of all the Commonwealth veterans out there were living in what we consider to be extreme poverty. So that means that they'll be able to get good nutrition, that they'll be living in dignity.
But critics are clear. While these men are in urgent need of aid, the injustices they suffered under British rule must also be redressed.
It wouldn't cost a great deal of money per individual. And as someone who studied this, destitute men who were in some way harmed, who were not well reintegrated into their home societies, then there may be an opportunity to right some wrongs.
Despite Britain's new aid package, David Williams still feels a deep sense of regret about the past treatment of African soldiers.
That is not something that I think we should be proud of, and certainly wouldn't fit into the whole ethos of what those of us who served with African troops would wish to have happened. But it did happen. We have to face the facts that, times were different. I don't necessarily believe it's something that's worthwhile of an apology. What we feel obliged to do is to make sure that we look after people who are in need. We can provide veterans with at least a meal a day and hopefully 2 meals a day. We do our best to help them.
Those few veterans still alive will not be with us for long. A few £1 million from the UK government to pay for meals, while helpful, is not much restitution for past injustices. What many want, most of all, is full recognition.
All former veterans have been afraid that they are being forgotten completely. Many of them died with their experiences. But the minute they die, that's gone. But we need to talk to them fast. We should not let them die with any information. Time is not on our side. When they are so old, they need help, they need assistance. Let them die knowing someone cared about them.